The man known to history as Charles Manson was born on the 12th of November 1934 in the city of Cincinnati in the state of Ohio. The identity of his father is not 100% certain. The most likely candidate was Colonel Walker Henderson Scott, a con artist and drifter from Kentucky. Charles's mother was Ada Kathleen Maddox, also a native of Kentucky. She and Henderson had been involved in a relationship in 1933 and 1934, which led to her becoming pregnant with Charles. When she informed him of the pregnancy, Henderson, whose given name Colonel was actually his name rather than any military title, claimed he had been called back for military duty and left her. He died years later from alcoholic-related liver disease. Charles would never know Henderson, if indeed he was his father. Instead, his surname Manson derives from a relationship which his mother Ada began with William Eugene Manson, a man she met and quickly married while she was pregnant with Charles. They would divorce less than 3 years later, but Charles has become synonymous with the Manson surname obtained from his mother's brief marriage, in large part because he used it as his surname in the 1960s. Charles Manson's early life was utterly dysfunctional. His mother was only 15 years old when she gave birth to him and had married William Manson, who was 10 years her senior and in his mid-20s. She was a reckless youth and mother who neglected Charles and would often disappear for days drinking around town, leaving her infant son with various babysitters or foisting him on William. Kathleen also allegedly engaged in prostitution. The cause of her divorce in 1937 was in part owing to William's complaints about her behavior as a parent. To compound matters, in the late summer of 1939, Charles's mother and his uncle, her brother Luther, were arrested for carrying out a violent robbery. His mother was sentenced to 5 years in prison, and Manson was sent to live with his aunt Glenna, Uncle Bill, and their daughter Joanne in West Virginia. Joanne would later reflect on how unruly he was even at this young age, often deliberately causing trouble in an effort to garner attention from others. Manson's behavior became more erratic before he was even a teenager. In an interview which he did with the ABC presenter Diane Sawyer in 1993, Manson claimed that he had set fire to his elementary school in West Virginia when he was just 9 years old. He also engaged in petty crime, including robbing from local stores. Owing to his behavior, he was eventually sent to Gibbolt School in Indiana, termed a school for wayward boys. He arrived there in 1947 when he was 12 years old and spent several months at what was a juvenile detention center in all but name. He escaped from Gibbolt before the end of 1947 and spent a period of time as a homeless drifter before returning home. His mother was unable to manage him and sent him back to the reform school in Indiana. There followed a peculiar period in which he again left Gibbolt without permission and spent several months drifting around, picking up odd bits of work and stealing to support himself in Indianapolis. This was still around his 13th and 14th year, emphasizing the chaos in his youth when he was just entering his teens. According to Manson in later years, his already wayward behavior and personality was further damaged by his experiences in the late 1940s and early 1950s. He was arrested for theft in Indianapolis in 1949 and sent to another reform school, this time in Nebraska. Here he only lasted a few days before escaping with another teenager there by the name of Blackie Nielsen. They then headed to Illinois, where they ended up engaging in further criminal acts. Manson had already developed a fairly clear pattern by this time of engaging in robberies and other crimes, and being swiftly arrested as he was not very good at it. Illinois was no exception, and within a few weeks he was picked up by police again. The next judge he ended up in front of sent him to Indiana Boys School, another reform institution. If Manson's later recollections about his early life are to be believed, he was assaulted several times while detained at this latest juvenile center before he escaped early in 1951. 16 years old by then, he headed west, stealing cars and robbing to support himself as he went. Up until this time, Manson had managed to avoid being incarcerated in a full prison, his age ensuring that he was sent to juvenile reform schools, though clearly in the 1940s and 1950s these were not somewhere one wanted to be either. Yet by 1951, he had reached an age at which a judge would be unwilling to show further lenience given his existing criminal record. Thus, when he was arrested in Utah on charges of grand theft auto, not long after escaping from Indiana boys' school, he was soon psychologically evaluated and sent to a full adult prison for the first time in Virginia. As wayward and destructive as Manson's behavior had been up to that point, it began to take on a new and more sinister edge here, with the future cult leader being caught assaulting a fellow inmate. This was just the first of numerous recorded acts of sexual violence committed by Manson during his time incarcerated in Virginia. He would later claim that he was uninterested in categorizing himself as straight, gay, or bisexual. Manson was eventually released in 1954, but the events of his teenage years had set the tone for his 20s, with Manson repeatedly engaging in crime sprees and then periodically ending up back in custody or some legal trouble or another. Grand theft auto was a particular obsession of his that would remain a constant right down to his final arrest and imprisonment at the end of the 1960s. Despite his intermittent arrests, he did find time to marry in 1955 to Rosie Willis, a 16-year-old waitress. She would give birth to his son and namesake, Charles Jr., in April 1956. It was also shortly after marrying Rosie that they moved out to California, beginning Manson's association with the state, which he would acquire infamy in over a decade later. Several more arrests occurred intermittently during this period, with Manson often being given suspended sentences on the condition that he cooperate with court authorities, though he generally didn't do so and was regularly arrested again for breaking the conditions of his parole. Manson could only dodge a second term in an adult prison for so long with his behavior, which by the late 1950s included not just regular acts of theft, grand theft auto and physical violence, but also acting as a pimp. This latter activity is notable as much of his cult leadership in later years would revolve around the manipulation of wayward young women. Rosie obtained a divorce from him through the courts in 1958, right around the time that he was arrested and prosecuted, this time on charges of financial fraud. Taking into account his growing criminal record, the courts decided he should be given a 10-year sentence on this occasion. It was not before he had met and made plans to marry a woman by the name of Leona Stevens. The marriage was solemnized in 1959, and she and Manson had a son named Charles Luther. He would have very little recorded interactions with either of these earlier sons in later years, though Charles Jr. took his own life in 1993, seemingly having found it difficult to live with the burden of being Charles Manson's son. Leona Stevens obtained a divorce in 1963, while Manson was still in prison. He would serve much of the 1960s behind bars, moving between several California prisons. During this time, he seems to have become habituated to life behind bars, on one occasion requesting that he be denied parole as he didn't want to be released. While it was also during the 8 years he spent incarcerated between 1959 and 1967 that he learned to play the guitar and developed an interest in music. Upon his release from prison early in 1967, Manson decided to relocate to San Francisco, where he found a place to live in an apartment in the Berkeley suburb of the city, near the oldest constituent campus of the University of California. He arrived here during an era-defining period in San Francisco's history. Following the holding of countercultural events in Golden Gate Park there earlier in the year, the city became a mecca of the counterculture and anti-war movement that was sweeping the United States in the second half of the 1960s. From the spring break of 1967, right around the time Manson arrived to Berkeley, the Haight-Ashbury district of the city in particular was seeing hundreds and sometimes thousands of hippies, musicians and artists every day. This would all culminate that summer when a series of festivals were held that drew upwards of 100,000 people to San Francisco in what became known as the Summer of Love. No doubt there were many elements to the Summer of Love which were positive and sought to critique America's involvement in the Vietnam War, amongst other things. At the same time, the environment could also act as a magnet for unstable personalities. The counterculture movement in San Francisco was an intellectual one in many ways, with the writings of the beat poets and the writers of the 1950s and early 1960s lionized, and people adopting eclectic elements of everything from Eastern religions to the philosophy of European thinkers of the 18th, 19th and 20th centuries, such as Friedrich Nietzsche, and even elements of Christianity. These things were not inherently problematic in and of themselves, but such an eclectic collection of philosophical, intellectual and social ideas, when absorbed by an unstable individual like Manson, could be shaped into a fairly warped ideology. By late 1967 and early 1968, he was promoting ideas to those he met which mixed discussion of Jesus Christ, elements of Nietzsche's philosophy, and a growing sense of white racial superiority. In particular, Manson had read about and seemed to promote the idea of living in religious communes, which harked back to the early days of Christianity or certain fringe groups that had prevailed in Christendom during the medieval period. This overlapped to some considerable extent with the tendency for hippie communes to emerge in San Francisco and other parts of the country in the late 1960s. As such, the movement Manson was about to orchestrate in 1968 and 1969 was born to some extent out of the counterculture movement in California in the late 1960s, though this does not mean it was representative of it. It simply is hard to imagine that he would have gained the following he was about to had it not been for the peculiar social conditions which prevailed here around the time of the Summer of Love. One sign of Manson's drift towards fringe religious and spiritual movements was his alleged association with the Church of Scientology in the 1960s. The details of this are somewhat fragmentary. The Church of Scientology had been established by the science fiction writer L. Ron Hubbard back in the early 1950s on the East Coast. He moved the organization's base to California in the mid-1950s, where he correctly believed its unusual religious ethos might flourish. Manson is understood to have first become involved in some capacity with the burgeoning church in the early 1960s, after being introduced to it by a fellow prisoner during one of his many periods of incarceration. He subsequently listed his religion as being Scientology, though his involvement with the movement across the 1960s was limited and certainly not sustained. Report has it that Manson had completed over 100 hours of auditing, an activity Scientologists engage in whereby a trained auditor allegedly cures an individual of their neuroses and spiritual problems. Furthermore, some of the other future members of the Manson family also had ties to the Church of Scientology. There is virtually no record, however, of any contact between Manson and the Church of Scientology during the late 1960s. In late 1967 and into 1968, Manson began gathering individuals around him in what would become the first stirrings of the Manson family. Operating in the Haight-Ashbury district of San Francisco, he portrayed himself as a guru and a latter-day Christian mystic of sorts. A clear pattern was quickly established. Manson attracted vulnerable women, many coming from damaged backgrounds or evidently suffering from one psychological issue or another. More than a few were still teenagers, often on drugs and susceptible to exploitation by a manipulative figure. These women soon began residing in and around the apartment of Mary Brunner, a librarian that Manson had begun a relationship with not long after arriving to San Francisco, and to whom his third son, Vincent Manson, was born in April 1968. By then, the Manson family had expanded to nearly 24 people. Amongst them, a number of individuals who would play a central part in the murders that followed in 1969. Charles Tex Watson was a man in his mid-20s from Texas who headed to Los Angeles around the time of the Summer of Love. Patricia Krenwinkel was a native of Los Angeles who was 20 years old in December 1967, had been bullied as a child and became a particularly vicious member of the Manson family. Susan Atkins was from California and had visited San Francisco late in 1966 when she was 18 years old, becoming a stripper there. Leslie Van Houten was a teenage runaway who had begun using psychotropic drugs when she was only 15 years old. Linda Kasabian was from the East Coast and had gravitated out west, as well as having 2 marriages collapse by the time she was just 18 years old. These individuals joined Manson's growing cult at different times, and there were other members of the Manson family, but these were some of the key players in the events that would unfold in 1969. From the beginning, the Manson family involved heavy drug use, and this was central to Manson's creation of a cult-like following. Manson would have his followers consume substantial amounts of drugs before group sessions in which he would, by all accounts, attempt to brainwash them into believing various outlandish theories. During these sessions, he would consume narcotics himself, though it seems probable that he did so in considerably smaller amounts than his followers did in order to maintain his own composure. While some of these drugs were somewhat benign, others can have powerful effects. For instance, when Tex Watson was psychologically evaluated in 1970, he was deemed to be acutely psychotic as a result of his heavy narcotics consumption. All of this was reputedly accompanied by orgies, and Manson might well have had more children through some of the women in the Manson family that are simply undocumented, as he employed sex as a further tool of control over his acolytes. Manson's story is strangely intertwined with the Beach Boys, a leading US band of the 1960s who had released their seminal album Pet Sounds, featuring the single Good Vibrations in 1966, shortly before Manson was released from prison. In April 1968, Krenwinkel and another female follower of Manson's became acquainted with Dennis Wilson, one of the founders and members of the Beach Boys, after he gave them a lift while hitchhiking in Los Angeles. One thing led to another, and on an evening not long after that, Wilson pulled into the driveway of his house on Sunset Boulevard to find Manson there with several of his followers. Today, this would most likely lead to the police being swiftly called, but in the permissive atmosphere of California in the late 1960s, Wilson instead invited them into his house and soon became a close acquaintance of Manson's. Within a few weeks, several members of the Manson family were living at Wilson's house on Sunset Boulevard, and he was in discussions with Manson to record at the Beach Boys' study. Eventually, the Beach Boys would rework and record one of Manson's songs. It was originally called Cease to Exist, though it was released under the title Never Learn to Love, as a B-side on their Bluebirds Over the Mountain single, which came out in December 1968. Crucially, this engagement with Wilson and the Beach Boys also brought Manson into contact with Terry Melcher, the band's producer, and a figure who seems to have given Manson at least some small hope that he might record an album of Manson's own music. It was during this long period of several months in the second half of 1968 that Manson and some of his followers probably committed the first murders that can be tied to the Manson family. For instance, Nancy Warren and Clyda Delaney were 2 people who were brutally murdered and strangled near the town of Ukiah in California in October 1968. It is on record that members of the Manson family were there right around the time that they were killed, though there is no conclusive evidence. More concrete is the murder of Marina Elizabeth Harb on the 30th of December 1968. She was known to either Manson or some of his followers. It was around this time that the drug intake of Manson and the others with him at Wilson's house on Sunset Boulevard also began to spiral to new levels. Wilson eventually became extremely concerned about their behavior, and rather than trying to evict them, he abandoned the house, leaving them to stay there until his lease expired. By then, they had totally trashed the mansion and stolen anything of value from inside it before moving on. Manson, though, would soon try to track down Terry Melcher and pursue a record deal. The next move for the Manson family was to the infamous Spahn Ranch. This was a large cattle ranch of over 50 acres on the northwestern outskirts of Los Angeles. It was owned by George Spahn, an elderly man who in the 1950s had hired the ranch out for use to several film studios to shoot westerns there during the golden age of the Hollywood studio system. With the decline of the studio system, Spahn's business with the film industry had dried up. and he had instead begun making money in various other capacities, hiring out horses to explore the region to tourists and the like. In late 1968, Spahn, who was approaching his 80th year and was nearly blind, agreed to allow the Manson family to live on the ranch without paying any rent, so long as they helped him out with various kinds of work, as well as helping him get around physically now that he was blind. The suggestion has also been made that several female members of the Manson family provided him with sexual favors in return for being allowed to stay there. Whatever the exact circumstances might have been, we know that Spahn Ranch now became the Manson family's base of operations for much of 1969, with dozens of Manson's followers living there with him. Life on Spahn Ranch followed the same peculiar patterns that had been established at Wilson's house on Sunset Boulevard and Brunner's in San Francisco before that. Criminal activity was being engaged in on a daily basis, and yet there was also a strange pastoral feel of family members giving tours to individuals looking to visit the Hollywood Hills on horseback and other parts of northern LA. All of this took place against the backdrop of old Western movie sets, with an entire Western town having been built here for shooting pictures at in the 1950s. There was also a large number of criminals coming and going frequently. Biker gangs that were heavily involved in drug-dealing operations around California were regular visitors to Spahn Ranch, as were a few local members of the Black Panthers, an African-American group that had been formed in 1966 and which was based in Oakland, California, one which J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI, had deemed to be the foremost threat to national security in America in the late 1960s. It was also around this time that Manson allegedly began forming some of his more bizarre theories and prejudices into a conspiracy theory about an apocalyptic near future. Over time, Manson's views about racial relations in America had become more and more extreme, to the extent that he could be categorized as a white supremacist after a time, and some years later would infamously carve a Nazi swastika into his own forehead. In 1969, he developed the idea that a race war between white and black Americans was imminent. He informed members of the Manson family about this, and reconstructions of what he outlined indicate that his theory included an eclectic mix of Old Testament prophecies, views on American slavery and segregation, and modern-day resentments about the progress of the civil rights movement in America in the 1950s and 1960s, all bundled together into the peculiar notion that this race war would happen within months or a few years and would be a battle for control of the United States. Part of this involved the notion that racist white people and non-racist white people would be manipulated into waging war on each other. Manson eventually named the theory Helter Skelter, after the title of a track on the Beatles' White Album that had been released in 1968. Manson had been listening to the album repeatedly since its release, and in his delusional state, believed the Liverpudlian band were trying to communicate some cryptic message to him. The first stage in the events that would become infamous around the world occurred in the mid-spring of 1969. On the 23rd of March, Manson headed to a house at 10,050 Cielo Drive, an upmarket house in Benedict Canyon near Beverly Hills. He believed that the Beach Boys record producer, Terry Melcher, was residing here, but was mistaken. Instead, the house was being rented at the time by the actress Sharon Tate and her husband, the Franco-Polish film director Roman Polanski, who the previous year had come to public attention following the release of his film Rosemary's Baby. Melcher had lived there previously but had since moved out, following which Tate and Polanski moved in. There, Manson spoke with several individuals and left, returning that evening and conversing again, this time with Rudolph Altobelli, a talent manager who owned the property, on which there were separate smaller guest houses. After this, Manson left. He had evidently aroused the suspicions of Tate and others through his peculiar behavior, and they must have been relieved not to see anything of him again after that day. Manson had not forgotten about the house at Cielo Drive, though. What can collectively be termed the Manson murders began in the summer of 1969. The first confirmable killing was a man in his early 20s called Bernard Crowe. He was a figure who was associated with the Black Panthers and who was involved in a drug-dealing operation with members of the Manson family and had fallen out with them, leading to threats and tension. On the 1st of July 1969, Manson killed Crow, following which Spahn Ranch was turned into an armed camp of sorts, in expectation of potential reprisals by the Black Panthers. Several weeks later, Manson and several of his followers, including one Bobby Beausoleil, went to the house of Gary Hinman, a music teacher who Manson believed had access to a considerable amount of money. In this particular instance, the motives were primarily to try to obtain cash. At Hinman's house, they detained him and held him captive for several days before Beausoleil stabbed Hinman to death. Only days later, Beausoleil would be arrested and the murder weapon was found in his car, but this did not lead to any police investigation of what was occurring at Spahn Ranch. As significant as the murders in July 1969 were, the Manson family's most noted crimes would take place over a period of just over 24 hours between the night of the 8th of August and the early hours of the 10th of August. In these particular instances, Manson had a clear agenda in ordering members of the Manson family to engage in targeted attacks against people who were well known. His idea in doing so was to try to start Helter Skelter, the name he had given to the impending race war that Manson had told his followers was going to occur. Manson explained that after the race war, which would become a nuclear conflict, the Manson family would be the only white people left alive, and that the black survivors would then turn to them for direction on how to shape a new world. As such, it was vital to foment and start Helter Skelter as quickly as possible, as it would benefit Manson and his acolytes. The best way of doing this, he asserted, was to murder prominent individuals and then frame black people for the murders, something which would start the race war. The first targets would be Sharon Tate and Roman Polanski, who Manson knew were living at 10,050 Cielo Drive, having been there months earlier when he was looking for Terry Melcher. Others have suggested that Manson had chosen the targets he did because he believed they were associated with Terry Melcher and that he was embittered about his failure to acquire a deal to record his own music with the producer. Manson did not take part directly in the Tate murders. Instead, he sent Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian to carry it out. Polanski was not at home at the time as he was in London working. Tate was there though, along with several others. A friend of Tate's who had previously been her partner, the hairdresser Jay Sebring, a Polish friend of Polanski's by the name of Wojciech Frykowski, and his partner Abigail Folger. Tate was over 8 months pregnant at the time. The 4 members of the Manson family had arrived to Benedict Canyon late on the 8th of August and entered sometime shortly after midnight on the 9th of August. Before they reached the house, they encountered a friend of the groundskeeper named Stephen Parent, whom Watson killed. They then broke into the house and woke up Tate, Frykowski, Sebring and Folger and forced them into the living room. In the period that followed, all 4 of them were butchered by Watson, Atkins and Krenwinkel. Kasabian seems to have frozen and then tried to prevent what was happening. Frykowski was shot and stabbed over 50 times. Folger managed to escape and got outside towards the pool area before Krenwinkel tackled her. She was killed by being stabbed nearly 30 times. Back in the house, Sebring was both shot and stabbed to death, while pregnant Sharon Tate was stabbed 16 times. She was also hung, though an autopsy would later confirm that she had bled to death. A further feature of the bloodbath that had occurred was that Atkins went around writing in blood afterwards, notably the word pig on the front door. Then they left. The following night on the 9th of August, again shortly before midnight, Watson, Krenwinkel, Kasabian and Atkins were accompanied by Manson, Leslie Van Houten and Clem Grogan to 3301 Waverly Drive near the Hollywood area in Los Angeles. This house belonged to Leno LaBianca, a retail executive, and Rosemary LaBianca. On this occasion, Manson took the lead, entering the house on his own first to survey the situation before returning to bring Watson, Van Houten and Krenwinkel into the house. There they roused Leno and Rosemary LaBianca. Manson had ordered the others to make the scene bloodier and more dramatic than the previous night, if that was possible. To do this, they had brought a bayonet, which they used to stab Leno to death while in the living room. Krenwinkel also stabbed him over a dozen times more. They further carved the word war into his chest, while Krenwinkel, who revealed herself to be possibly the most deranged and violent of all of Manson's acolytes during the murders, enthusiastically went about writing things like Helter Skelter and Death to Pigs on the walls in blood. Rosemary was murdered in one of the bedrooms with a bayonet. Then, having created the second gruesome murder scene in the space of just over 24 hours, they fled. There were possibly other murders during the Manson family killing spree in the summer of 1969. On the very same night as the LaBianca murders, they had gone to the home of Saladin Nader, a Middle Eastern actor, with the intention of killing him too. But Kasabian was sent to do it and claimed afterwards that she foiled the plan by heading to the back door of someone else's apartment. A teenager by the name of Mark Waltz was seemingly kidnapped from Santa Monica Pier when fishing in mid-July and killed, his body being dumped on Mulholland Drive afterwards. He was known to associate with the Manson family at Spahn Ranch and possibly was killed on Manson's orders. In late August 1969, a stuntman by the name of Donald Shea, who was working for a time at Spahn Ranch, also disappeared. His remains were found 8 years later, and it is assumed by most who have studied the Manson family's activities that he was killed by them a few weeks after the massacres at the Tate and LaBianca homes. Several other murders occurred in the autumn and early winter of 1969 that can be tied to the Manson family in one way or another. While there are also numerous unsolved murders in California in 1968 that prosecutors later affirmed that there was substantial evidence to suggest were carried out either by Manson or his followers. The Tate murders were high-profile and sinister enough that substantial police resources were deployed in their aftermath to try and discover who had been responsible for the killings. As the investigation developed, the police began to think that there might be connections between the Tate and LaBianca killings. Noting similarities in terms of the weapons used and the manner of the killings, with stab wounds inflicted and writing in blood on the walls. William Garrettson, the caretaker who lived in the side guest house at Cielo Drive where Tate and Polanski were residing, was briefly arrested and questioned. Investigators finding it hard to believe that he could have been at home on the night in question and have heard nothing, particularly since Folger had managed to escape outside to the pool area before she was killed, and must have shouted or made some noise. He claimed he had only realized something was amiss the following morning. He was eventually released and cleared of all suspicion. After this, the detectives had few promising leads, and the cases were hampered by the unwillingness of detectives investigating the Tate and LaBianca murders to amalgamate the cases into one investigation or to share their leads. The police eventually homed in on the Manson family through a series of fortuitous events. Firstly, several members of the family were arrested in mid-October 1969 by the county sheriff, not for anything to do with the murders, but for a completely unrelated incident in which they were deemed to have vandalized a national monument at Death Valley National Park in the Mojave Desert, along with claims that they were running a Grand Theft Auto operation from Spahn Ranch. Manson was amongst those arrested during these initial unrelated events just a week after the Tate and LaBianca murders. The weak link, once several of the Manson family members were in prison, proved to be Susan Atkins, once she and several others were detained. She confessed to the murders to two fellow prisoners, who then alerted the authorities to what she revealed. From there, police began looking at the possibility that members of the Manson family had been involved in the murders and were soon building a compelling dossier of evidence to that effect, notably when they tracked down some members of local biker gangs who had been in contact with the Manson family at Spahn Ranch. With what seemed like a bulletproof amount of evidence, the police moved in the early winter and arrested many more members of the Manson family. Charges were soon pressed in the California courts to charge them with the Tate and LaBianca murders, though prosecutors were already aware of the possibility that Manson and his followers had been involved in several other murders. The Manson family trials, which began in the summer of 1970, became some of the most sensational court cases in modern history. In the foremost trial, Manson was the defendant along with Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel and Leslie Van Houten. Press attention was intense, and Manson himself and several other members of the family seemed to revel in the attention. Susan Atkins boasted that they had intended to engage in other high-profile murders if they had been allowed to in order to foment helter-skelter, including the actors Steve McQueen, Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor. Manson's lawyer, Ronald Hughes, was killed while camping not long after he had dropped Charles as a client, claiming he believed that Leslie Van Houten could be defended legitimately as she had only been 19 at the time, and Hughes argued she had diminished responsibility. It was widely believed at the time, though never proved, that members of the Manson family had been responsible for Hughes's murder. The trial otherwise ran for the better part of half a year. At one point in it, Manson appeared having carved an X into his forehead, and several Manson family members followed suit, including some who had not been charged with any crimes and who showed up to the court every day to try to disrupt proceedings outside, some menacingly carrying large hunting knives. Testimony was shocking, with new witnesses appearing to allude to other potential murders, while there were constant disruptions as Manson, who demanded to be allowed to question witnesses and defendants, rambled in a broadly incoherent fashion at times. One of the key witnesses was Linda Kasabian, who was granted immunity for testifying against Manson and the other figures who had been involved in the Tate and LaBianca murders. The court proceedings drew to a conclusion for the most part in November 1970, though they were further disrupted by Hughes's murder. The jury gave their decisions at the end of January 1971, by which time Manson had shaved his head and was claiming to be the devil. All 4 defendants were found guilty on 27 different charges. In delivering the verdict, it was noted that while Manson could not be found directly guilty of having committed the Tate or LaBianca murders, he was culpable in all cases, as he orchestrated and ordered the murders. 2 months later, the judge ordered the death penalty for all 4. They would never be executed though, as a state ruling in 1972 essentially brought the death penalty to an end in the state of California. All 4 had their sentences commuted to life in prison. Over the years, they would regularly have parole hearings, often televised given the public interest in their cases. These would almost universally result in rejections. Manson would never be released, and stopped attending his parole hearings after a time. Susan Atkins died in prison in 2009. Patricia Krenwinkel is still in prison and is the longest-serving female prisoner in the state of California. Leslie Van Houten was released from prison in 2023 at 73 years of age. She had been recommended for parole for several years, having been deemed to have been genuinely remorseful for what she had done. Many other members of the Manson family were arrested and incarcerated in the course of the 1970s, though the group was so large and the levels of culpability in their crimes varied enough that some people could never be charged with any crimes. Inevitably, given the public fascination with the Manson killings and the almost occult element to them, conspiracy theories have arisen surrounding the Manson family in the decades since. Many of them are outlandish. That said, there are also a lot of facts about the case which remain highly peculiar. One is the question of how Manson and several other members of the Manson family, such as Susan Atkins, who already had major criminal records by 1968 and 1969, were even in a position to carry out the murders. These were individuals who were known to the authorities and had cases open with parole officers in the late 1960s. Examination of their police files by journalists who have studied the case since have revealed not just bureaucratic oversights in allowing Manson and others to not be arrested in the year or so prior to the murders, but what could also be interpreted as a deliberate attempt to keep them out of jail. One theory holds that police in California at the time were attempting to use the Manson family in some way to undermine the Black Panthers, who were viewed by the CIA at the time as posing a major threat to civil society in California. This might explain why Manson, a terrible criminal who was constantly being arrested in the 1950s and 1960s on the few occasions that he was actually out of prison and seemed to never be able to avoid being arrested for longer than a few months, was seemingly unimpeded by law enforcement in the late 1960s, while he established a cult that was engaged in wanton criminality for over a year at the Wilsons' house on Sunset Boulevard and then at Spahn Ranch. It has also been suggested that the idea that the killings were engaged in to try to foment helter-skelter, Manson's supposed race war, was overstated by Vincent Bugliosi, one of the lead prosecutors on the case, who was determined to forge a political career out of the whole affair, in his book Helter Skelter, co-authored with Kurt Gentry and published in 1974. Bugliosi was planning this even before the trial began and had arranged for Gentry to be present in the court to take notes while the trial was ongoing in 1970. None of this is to suggest that the more outlandish conspiracy theories concerning the Manson family have any merit, but simply to note that there are some unanswered questions surrounding it even a half a century later. Just a few years into Manson's prison sentence, the Manson family were back in the news when a member of the family, Squeaky Fromme, tried to assassinate President Gerald Ford, Richard Nixon's former vice president, who had succeeded to the Oval Office unelected after Nixon was forced to resign in the wake of the Watergate scandal. Fromme had avoided incarceration at the time of the wider Manson family trials, though she was a clear danger to public safety, being one of Charles's most devoted followers and someone who had tried to interfere with witnesses in the trial in 1970. Her alleged reason for attempting to kill Ford was over environmental issues. Fortunately for the president, her effort was completely botched. Although she had a handgun and managed to get within feet of Ford while he was on an official visit to Sacramento in California on the 5th of September 1975, she had neglected to load a bullet into the chamber of her antiquated weapon, and so when she attempted to shoot Ford from point-blank range, nothing happened. She was quickly bundled away by the Secret Services and charges were pressed. She received a life sentence for the murder attempt, of which Fromme served 34 years, being released in 2009. Manson spent his first years behind bars at Folsom Prison. He was transferred from there to California Medical Facility in 1976, a prison in Central California for prisoners with medical illnesses and who are to be psychologically evaluated. He spent the next 9 years here and might have spent longer had it not been for a serious attack in September 1984. During this, a fellow inmate, who believed God had told him to kill Manson, doused the former cult leader with paint thinner and set him on fire. Manson ended up with moderately severe burns and had to be treated for several weeks. Following this, he was transferred out of the California Medical Facility and sent to San Quentin Prison in the summer of 1985. Finally, 4 years later, in 1989, he was transferred to the state prison at Corcoran. He would spend virtually all of his remaining life, a period of nearly 3 decades here, barring a spell of just over a year at a maximum security facility at Pelican Bay State Prison, the latter being a punishment for Manson having been implicated in a drug distribution ring at Corcoran in the mid-1990s. The terms of Manson's confinement during these years were strict. He was provided with his own cell in one of the maximum security wings of Corcoran, where he was confined near other notorious California murderers. An interview with prison staff in 2009, when he was in his mid-70s, revealed that Manson spent most of his time alone in his cell. He received quite a lot of fan mail from people who either believed that Manson had been framed in some fashion and who were adherents of various conspiracy theorists, or people who, for one peculiar reason or another, had come to view him as a sympathetic figure. He was allowed visitors, and some people did occasionally call, though it was noted that he tended to add and remove people from his visitation list for seemingly unknown reasons from time to time. There were also various efforts made during his long years of incarceration to diagnose Manson. No conclusive explanation for his behavior was ever reached, with some contending he displayed signs of severe schizophrenia and other psychological conditions. Others claimed Manson was pretending to be insane, with various motives put forward to explain this, while further reports, which are probably closer to the truth, argued that Manson's behavior over the years was owing to a combination of many different factors, including his own life experiences and his innately imbalanced psychology, compounded by a severe intake of psychotropic drugs in the 1960s, which made an already delusional and violent character even more unstable. Beginning in the mid-1980s, after he was transferred to San Quentin and then later to Corcoran, Manson was interviewed several times by prominent media figures for major American television networks. When he was, audiences were surprised to see that at some stage during his time at California Medical Facility or somewhere else, he had decided to carve a Nazi swastika into his forehead between his eyebrows where earlier he had carved an X during his trial. Charlie Rose interviewed Manson in a show that went out on CBS in 1986, followed by an interview by Geraldo Rivera in 1988 for a documentary he was making on Satanism in 1980s America. Perhaps the most revelatory was a 1993 interview with Diane Sawyer, in which Manson's behavior was incredibly erratic and unhinged. In all of these interviews, he came across as combative and provided often meandering and incoherent answers to many questions put to him. This included strange defenses of his actions in which he claimed everything he had done had been out of love for God, and seemingly because of his broken background, with Manson claiming that those who were in prisons in the United States were generally there because they had been neglected by fathers who came back damaged from serving in the Second World War. Bizarrely, it was only in 1994, not long after the Sawyer interview, that the Tate House at Cielo Drive was demolished, with numerous individuals having continued to rent and live in the house after the murders there in 1969. Manson's later years continued much as they had before in many respects. He continued to be under fairly close confinement, though inevitably, as he became an elderly man, prison authorities could not but loosen the controls around him. He was, for instance, allowed to resume his interest in music and recorded some songs in prison. These have never been made publicly available. Perhaps the most peculiar element of his later years concerned a fan by the name of Afton Elaine Burton. Burton came from a religiously devout Baptist family from Illinois. She became obsessed with Manson after first learning about him while undertaking a school project when she was 17 years old. When she was 19, she moved out to California to be close to the prison at Corcoran, having established a correspondence with Manson. There she began visiting him regularly in person, eventually becoming engaged to him in 2014, when Manson was about to turn 80 and she was 26 years old. She even shaved her head and carved an X temporarily in the middle of her forehead to mimic his swastika. The marriage only fell through when rumors circulated that Burton was intending to take possession of Manson's body when he died in order to have it preserved and turned into a tourist attraction. The story is not as unusual as it seems, and other infamous killers such as Ted Bundy attracted obsessive female fans at various times over the last several decades. Manson was refused parole following what was his 12th parole hearing in the spring of 2012. The board determined that at this particular juncture that he would not be eligible again for a hearing until 2027. By then, he would be a man in his early 90s, and it was assumed he would probably have died by then. As such, the 2012 hearing essentially concluded by informing Manson that he would die in prison. It would be nearly 6 years before that occurred. By the mid-2010s, he was an increasingly ill man, his advanced years exacerbated by decades of incarceration. Early in 2017, he experienced a series of medical issues which stemmed primarily from colon cancer that had led to substantial internal bleeding. Surgery was ruled out, and Manson spent much of that year in various prison medical facilities. He died on the 19th of November 2017 at a prison medical facility in Bakersfield, California at 83 years of age, officially from a heart attack, though with exacerbating factors. After a legal dispute, his body was released to a grandson who had Manson's remains cremated. As a result, there is no grave that might act as a pilgrimage site for those who have developed warped enough views concerning Manson to view him as some sort of modern prophet. Manson and the Manson family have become the subjects of many books, television series, and films over the years. One of the earliest was Helter Skelter, a television film released in 1976 based on Vincent Bugliosi's account of the Manson murders and trials. Perhaps the most peculiar addition to the genre was an opera in 1990, while since then, Manson has featured in everything from an episode of The Ben Stiller Show in the early 1990s to an installment of South Park. More serious investigations of the Manson family's activities and what really went on at Spahn Ranch have also appeared, while some members of the Manson family have been interviewed in their later years. A memoir by Diane Lake, who was not involved in the murders but ended up as a 14-year-old being drawn into the Manson family before leaving the cult, also appeared in 2017. Finally, in 2019, Quentin Tarantino directed Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, a fictional story which uses the Manson family's presence at Spahn Ranch as a central motif. Overall, Charles Manson's story has never been out of the public consciousness since the late 1960s. Charles Manson was one of the most notorious figures in American life in the second half of the 20th century, with the Manson family becoming synonymous with violent cult activity, above all owing to the brutal Tate LaBianca murders. The circumstances around these and other murders committed by his followers may have been shadowy enough that Manson was able to claim some degree of limited responsibility for them, as he was not present during the Tate murders. But there is no doubting that he was culpable for everything that happened and orchestrated it. The violent murder spree which he and his followers engaged in during the late 1960s were the culmination of a lifetime of peculiar personal experiences going right back to his chaotic childhood, disturbed teenage years, and constant run-ins with the law, which led to him spending much of his life in prison even before the murders. His unstable character became even more problematic after he went to live in California and large amounts of drugs were introduced into the mix. All of this combined with the eclectic social environment of San Francisco and Los Angeles in 1968 and 1969 to allow him to garner a cohort of impressionable and unstable followers, many of them young, troubled women who were responsive to Manson's increasingly paranoid and deranged theories about impending race wars. It all exploded in 1969 in at least 9 murders and possibly many more. Manson lived out nearly half a century of his remaining life behind bars, surely being a classic example of someone too dangerous to even contemplate returning back to society. What do you think of Charles Manson? Was he a deranged individual who was barely cognizant of how unacceptable all of his actions were? Or was he a scheming, calculating person who manipulated others to the maximum extent possible? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.